destroyed a house in Gaza, wounding 2 people. Israel says they targeted a house used by Hamas militants. The Palestinians deny it. And Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice armed with a plan. She met with Israel's prime minister a few hours ago about a possible international force in South Lebanon. Now, this is Rice's 2nd trip to the region in a week. Coming up in 30 minutes on Larry King Live, 25 years after his murdered son's abduction, John Walsh of America's Most Wanted sits down with Larry for an intense hour. I'm Carol Lynn in Atlanta. More news in 30 minutes. But right now, back to CNN Presents Marine Barracks Bombing.
The plan was as ruthless as it was daring. A delivery truck, a high-tech bomb, an unsuspecting target. October 23rd, 1983, the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, Lebanon. Who was behind the suicide attack, and how did they pull it off? We get down to the details of that deadly day. Sunday, October 23rd, 1983. It's just after 6 a.m. The night before had been calm, but as the sun creeps over the mountains, guards remain on high alert. They've been warned to be on the lookout for suspicious vehicles.
I mean, they were shooting Marines. Marine patrols couldn't go to the southern suburbs. It's a lot like Iraq today.
At their airport headquarters, many of the Marines are still in bed. That Sunday morning, reveille is replaced by a massive explosion.
We interrupt this program to bring you this bulletin. This just in from Beirut.
According to a report compiled by the Department of Defense, this is how the attack unfolded. At approximately 6:20 a.m., a yellow Mercedes-Benz water delivery truck turns off an access road onto the parking lot of the Marine barracks. It then circles several times as it picks up speed. Suddenly, the driver crashes through a barbed wire fence, driving between 2 Marine guard posts without drawing fire. Seconds later, the truck plows through a gate and crashes into the barracks. The bomb is detonated. The force of the explosion reduces the building to rubble, crushing many inside.
This was the largest non-nuclear explosion since World War II. Somewhere between 15,000 and 21,000 pounds equivalent TNT. It was an 8-foot crater in the ground there. It just blew everything apart.
20 seconds later, a second explosion. A car bomb rips through the barracks of the French peacekeeping force just a few miles away, killing 58 paratroopers. Rescue efforts continue for days, at times hindered by sniper fire. Retired Colonel Timothy Garrity was the Marine commander in Beirut.
The ground was moaning because there were survivors in there.
The United States had suffered the largest loss of military life in a single incident since Iwo Jima. 220 Marines, 18 Navy sailors, and 3 Army soldiers killed by a lone suicide bomber.
This was such a overt, pure, naked act of terrorism. We had absolutely no warning of something of this magnitude that hit us.
Back home, a mourning nation demanded answers. How did it happen? Who was responsible? Should the U.S. strike back? A full-scale investigation began immediately. Retired Lieutenant General Lawrence Snowden served on the investigation into the attack.
We had every reason to believe that Hezbollah was the unit that did the job. And we do know that the operation had the support of the Syrian government and the Iranian government.
Hezbollah denies any responsibility. Mark Perry has studied Hezbollah for years and has discussed the bombing with several members.
In the talks that I've had with them in Beirut, they say the United States is not our enemy. We do not have American blood on our hands. We do not want to have a conflict with the United States. And I would place the barracks bombing at the doorstep of Iran.
A civil case in 2003 did just that. The judge ruled the suicide bombing was carried out by Hezbollah with the approval and funding of Iran. Retired Admiral James Lyons testified U.S. officials intercepted a message from the Iranian ambassador to Syria.
This is the smoking gun. There was proof positive to coordinate their attacks against the multinational force, and in particular, the United States Marines.
The court also heard the videotaped testimony of a Hezbollah member known as Mahmoud. Mahmoud described how Hezbollah ambushed a water truck en route to the compound. A similar truck, laden with very sophisticated explosives, continued on to the barracks. The driver would later be nicknamed Smiling Death by a Marine guard who recalled the bomber's chilling expression as he crashed through the gates just before the explosion.
It was unfortunate that so many troops were allowed to be in that building at one time.
I was criticized quite severely, one, for having that many Marines in a single building. I had absolutely no choice. We were taking shelling. It was considered to be one of the safest, sturdiest buildings in Beirut.
Marine commanders were also criticized for having guards with empty weapons.
There was a real concern that if there was an accidental discharge of a weapon, some, quote, innocent civilian might be killed or wounded in that parking lot. But in hindsight, it was not a good idea.
As the list of suspects narrowed, U.S. officials say this man, Imad Mughniya, emerged as the mastermind. Mughniya was Hezbollah's security chief at the time of the bombing.
He's much better than bin Laden because he stays off television. He doesn't identify himself. And you don't ever see a defector from his inner circle, or one that lives very long.
Coming up, the U.S. response to terror, paralyzed by White House infighting.
For a smarter way to move, we designed the PODS container.
Tanks are moving across the border. I hope you'll stay with Fox News for the very, very latest. It's obviously an amazing development over there with Secretary Rice over in the Middle East. We'll see if there are any developments towards some sort of an agreement. Folks, that's all the time we have for tonight. You can watch my blog. Drop us a line at heartland@foxnews.com, or perhaps you can take a look at my website, johnkasich.com. Hope you'll stay tuned for the lineup, and at 10 p.m., it's Big Story Prime Time. Thanks for staying with us. Hope you learned a little bit tonight, and we'll see you again next week. Good night, folks.
In the lineup tonight, inside Hezbollah, could the terrorist group's next target be the United States? Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah spoke today. Are his words sending coded messages to cells worldwide? And when will Hezbollah cells in the United States become operational? Breaking developments as they happen from the front lines of the war in the Mideast. Plus, caught on camera, Joran Vandersloot seen frolicking with a beautiful young blonde on the very same beach he says he last saw Natalie Holloway alive. And later, another blow to Royal Caribbean. A beautiful young woman disappears from her Mediterranean cruise vacation. Sound like deja vu? It should. Newlywed groom George Allen Smith vanished from his Royal Caribbean honeymoon on the high seas over a year ago. We'll explore the eerie similarities between two tragic cruise getaways. Those stories and more in the lineup right now. Good evening and welcome to the lineup. I'm Kimberly Guilfoyle. Tensions in the Mideast continue to rise tonight as Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice makes a return trip to the region in hopes of a ceasefire. Let's go straight to Trace Gallagher, who is standing by in Kiryat Shimona with the latest. All right, Trace.
Well, I can tell you Condoleezza Rice.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right, Israel pulled out of Bin Jbeil saying that they had finished their mission there. Is it now secure, and what precautions did they take to prevent Hezbollah from returning?
Well, they pulled out because they said that they had achieved their objectives, which is they went in, they probably attacked the infrastructure of Hezbollah, and we believe they probably looked for weapons, and then they pulled out. Remember, the goal was never to go in and occupy Bin Jbeil, so what they did is they went in, they did their task, and they came back out. Could it fill back up? They always said there was a chance that it could be a vacuum and that Hezbollah could come back, but every once in a while you will hear the artillery fire from Israel being fired into there, and they are still targeting that area. So even though the ground troops are out, the air troops and the artillery is still going in there. So Hezbollah, the odds are fairly good they're not going to come back right away. They may soon come back, but by then the hope is there will be a multinational peacekeeping force along the border to keep them from going back into Bin Jbeil and producing more rockets and firing them onto this side of the border, Kimberly.
Trace, a new development in that Nasrallah has threatened to attack deeper into central Israel. What cities do you think could be at risk?
Well, you know, so far he's hit Aful and Haifa, and if you look at the map, you're talking about 31 miles from where we are right now. That's Afula. That's the farthest they've gotten. Now, he has said over the course of the past several days that there's some speculation that he may have a missile that could reach Tel Aviv. Now, that really is a bold statement because from the border to Tel Aviv, you're talking about some 70 miles. So you go from 31 miles to 70 miles. That's a long stretch. Can he hit Haifa? Sure, they have shown that. They can hit Afula, but to get into the central part of Israel, which is Tel Aviv, there is speculation he may have those rockets, but right now there's a lot of military experts saying that they don't think so. And if they do have those capabilities, the rockets will be fired very much willy-nilly. In other words, they can't be guided, so really it's anybody's guess where they might end up.
All right, Trace, thanks for that report. And one day after firing its most powerful rocket yet into the Israeli town of Afula, Hezbollah's chief making new threats making an appearance on television. The terror leader threatening more attacks targeting central Israel. Jonathan Hunt is live in Beirut, where fireworks erupted after his speech.
Kimberly, good evening to you. The Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, like Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq before him, is now taunting his enemies via video, releasing this statement tonight with three basic messages. First of all, Hezbollah is not backing down. No talk of a deal, no talk of negotiations, no mention of ceasefires. In fact, he is threatening to take the war further into Israel, striking cities deeper and deeper into that country. He also criticized Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, saying that she is in the region just to serve Israel's interests and to impose conditions on Lebanon. And he painted this war so far as one of heroic resistance by Hezbollah in what amounted to, at times, a victory.
Opens. Part of our team, in fact, was at the earlier tonight and saw the armored D9 bulldozers going in to level the terrain there. They are also using explosives to blow up buildings used by Hezbollah for cover near the border. They are encountering some resistance, according to our team, who is watching at the border still as we speak. Reports from here suggest Condoleezza Rice would like the outline of a ceasefire to be presented to the UN Security Council by Wednesday. Both sides would like to declare victory before a ceasefire is pushed through the UN Security Council. Now, Kimberly, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah also delivered a taped 30-minute address on Al-Manar, that's Hezbollah TV, earlier today. This is all part of an effort to paint the last 19 days as a victory for his loyalists. He tried to rally his fighters by taunting the Israeli military during the taped interview, painting his army as David against Israel's Goliath, mocking Israel's elite Golani troops who were injured and killed in South Lebanon, recounting his own group's surprising successes, like the disabling of a sophisticated Israeli Navy warship at the beginning of the offensive. What's interesting about this video, Kimberly, is that what you see is Nasrallah sitting in front of the Lebanese flag. He is not placed in front of the yellow Hezbollah flag, as maybe in previous interviews. He is positioning himself as the leader of Lebanon. And what's also interesting, we've heard from our team up in Beirut that recent polls in Lebanon show that 82% of the population there are supporting Hezbollah's activities and not blaming them for the current crisis. Kimberly?
All right, Jennifer, thank you for that report. And as we approach the third week of this conflict, we're learning more about the terrorist organization Hezbollah, described as the A-team amongst terror groups. They are to Israel what al-Qaeda is to the United States. So how did this group become so powerful and influential on a global scale? Let's bring back former CIA agent Bob Baer, who joins us once again. Bob, thanks for being with us. Now, you've spent time with Hezbollah. You know them as well as anybody else, any Westerner. What separates them from other terror groups?
They are head and shoulders above al-Qaeda. They are combat hardened. In the civil war in Beirut, they managed to cover up their tracks, and they've had more experience than any other terrorist group. They blew up the Marines. They blew up 2 of our embassies in Lebanon. They were behind the Khobar attacks in Saudi Arabia, hostage taking, and on and on and on.
All right, well, they have been
if they do not get aid into southern Lebanon quickly. And Jamie, I just want to go back to Hassan Nasrallah quickly. One statement he said today was very important, I think. He said a victory for Hezbollah is a victory for every Lebanese. He is appealing to this country to unite behind Hezbollah, and it seems to be having an effect. A poll released yesterday said 82% of Lebanese now support what Hezbollah is doing. Jamie?
Jonathan Hunt for us in Beirut with the very latest. Thank you. If anyone knows about war, it's our very own Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, and he joins us now live in New York. Colonel, great to see you.
Jamie, good to be with you.
With this intensification now, with the troops, the Fox News crew there, watching them go on a new offensive in a different area, what are your thoughts?
Search and clear operations. These are common for these kinds of endeavors by the Israelis. What they're trying to do is clear certain areas that have been occupied by Hezbollah, used as staging areas, used as places where they could fire those rockets into Israel, and make sure that those are cleared in anticipation that what's probably going to happen is a diplomatic initiative is going to result in some kind of ceasefire. They want to clear those, if you will, outposts of Hezbollah on the southern frontier so that an international force, not of peacekeepers, but rather an intervention force, can come in and keep Hezbollah out of that area.
In your column, which I happened to take a look at, you say that this is a problem for Americans. We've been watching the people in the area, Lebanese and Israeli, affected, but what does it mean for us, and why should we be concerned?
You know, Hezbollah has killed more Americans than any other terrorist organization in the world, except al-Qaeda. And because of 9/11 and the 2 towers coming down, al-Qaeda took, if you will, the Supreme Masters of Mayhem award. Hezbollah has been a long-term enemy of the United States. We are second only to the Israelis in terms of casualties inflicted by Hezbollah. And what Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah is talking about, of course, is an operation that's aimed specifically at, quote, liberating Lebanon. In fact, this is an organization that has targeted consistently Americans. We have a major interest in seeing that Hezbollah is disarmed as part of the outcome of this.
When you talk about international forces coming in, you've also said that Americans are already suffering from army fatigue, military fatigue, in a sense. Would U.S. forces be involved in that, and could Americans rally in support of that?
We just heard both in Jonathan and Jennifer's reports discussions that the French have already agreed. I think what we need to be considering here in the United States is think Kosovo, where you've got a NATO-led organization, not the United Nations. You cannot put Fijians in blue helmets in there as observers and expect that this is going to stop. And the Israelis have been gone for a long time from southern Lebanon. The promise was that the Lebanese would assert sovereignty over their entire country. It didn't happen because of Hezbollah and their connections to Damascus and Tehran. What has to happen is that Damascus and Tehran have to know that there are terrible consequences for their continued support for Hezbollah, and an international intervention force that may well include Americans. We've got some 2,000 U.S. Marines right now helping to provide humanitarian assistance and evacuations. I would expect that you're ultimately going to see not just the French, but the British, perhaps the Canadians, maybe even the Egyptians or the Turks, step in as part of a multinational operation, NATO-led, that will go in with force and make sure that Hezbollah clears a barrier of 10 to 25 miles in the southern frontier until the Lebanese government can assert its own authority.
When and if. I want to ask you to stay with us, because when we come back, I want to ask you if a ceasefire means peace. Hang on for a second with us. Coming up, a new tape released by Hezbollah's leader calling for more violent attacks against Israel. But what else is in his message, and should it concern us even more? And later, a big story, primetime exclusive. The president of Syria speaks out. What does he intend to do about this conflict? We'll be right back.
The captioning for this program is brought to you by...
Can an odor-free cream stand up to your back pain?
You bet if it's Asper Cream.
Maximum strength and odor-free. Arthritis pain stopped?
You bet if it's Asper Cream.
Make it fun.
Love your look? Or change your look with LensCrafters 30-day unconditional guarantee and 2,000 styles to choose from. You can wear them or change them till you love them. Guaranteed. LensCrafters.
Okay, who's marking the Miracle Whip at $1,000 a jar?
Bad news for turkeys, good news for you. With more flavor and half the fat of mayonnaise, Miracle Whip makes a better turkey sandwich.
Pop quiz. What midsize sedan has more space and power than Camry, has 6 standard airbags, gets up to 34 miles per gallon, and starts under $16,000? Is it A, the all-new Kia Optima, B, the brand-new Kia Optima, C, the shiny new Kia Optima, or D, all of the above? Correct! You picked the Kia Optima, and with the 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty, there really is no other choice. Right now, the all-new Optima starts at under $16,000. To learn more, visit kia.com.
Since when does using a dandruff shampoo feel this good? New Head & Shoulders Ocean Lift. Its formula is enhanced with a sea mineral essence for scalp that's healthy, dandruff-free, and hair that's revitalized. And it has an invigorating scent that you wouldn't expect from a dandruff shampoo. For hair that's healthy and full of life, take a rejuvenating escape. New Head & Shoulders Ocean Lift. Surprise yourself.
My kids call me the finisher. Finish up in there.
Okay.
Finish your homework?
Yes.
Finish your vegetables. Something I thought I was finished with? Managing my acid reflux disease. I thought it was just bad heartburn, but my doctor said over time, stomach acid was damaging the lining of my esophagus. She prescribed Nexium. Said I needed more than heartburn relief. My esophagus needed repair. 1 prescription Nexium pill a day not only relieves my heartburn, it healed erosions in my esophagus. So I don't just feel better, I am better. And with the Purple Plus program, I get advice on nutrition, exercise, even ways to save on Nexium. My doctor did say headache, diarrhea, and abdominal pain could be side effects of Nexium, and other serious stomach conditions may still exist.
Talk to your doctor about the healing purple pill.
I tell him you shouldn't do anything halfway. Let's finish up.
If you're without prescription coverage and can't afford your medication, AstraZeneca may be able to help.
This weekend, despite calls for a ceasefire, fighting rages in the Mideast. What's the next step to restore peace? Plus, the president's new plan to stop violence in Baghdad. Will it work? Ambassador Paul Bremer weighs in. It's all on the next Fox News Sunday.
Beirut, 1983. The first Americans fall victim to Hezbollah. You'll hear from former hostages telling stories of covert missions and secret battles to save American lives. It's an exclusive inside look at Hezbollah and the events that bring us to today's conflict.
And welcome back to the Big Story Primetime. I'm Jamie Colby. Hezbollah, it's not just a terrorist group that affects the Middle East. Hezbollah is responsible for more deaths than any other terror organization besides Al-Qaeda. Americans are second only to Israelis as the most killed by Hezbollah. Back with us again to discuss the threat here at home, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, host of Fox's War Stories, which is going to be live tomorrow night, 8 o'clock Eastern.
A special on Hezbollah, and just so that the American people know what a threat that this organization poses. You know, last week, the Hezbollah spokesman in Tehran, now anybody who doubts the connection back to Iran is, you know, missing something. The Hezbollah spokesman in Tehran threatened, quote, World War III, and basically said, bring it on. What they are trying to do, of course, is to provoke
an international incident well beyond the borders of Lebanon. And the real problem for us is dealing with literally dozens and dozens of these characters who have killed Americans, taken them hostage, held some of them. We're going to have guests tomorrow night, one of who's the longest held American hostage in history, who is their prisoner, Terry Anderson.
It's almost impossible to imagine that this could end without Iran and Syria coming to the table. And the question I have is, what are the incentives for them to get involved? Because even if you take out Hezbollah, don't you still have Iran and Syria? And particularly with Iran, we've heard from the president there, tremendous hate for Israel.
Well, I think what you've got to look at is the possibility that Tehran is ultimately the kingpin of all of this. Syria is mostly a conduit. The Syrians don't do anything that the Iranians don't want them to do, and everything the Iranians want Syria to do, gets done. What I think, Jamie, you're going to have to see is the Iranians, and there are reasonable people in Tehran. They may not be the ayatollahs and the mullahs that are running the country, but there are technocrats who know the West, who want a better life for the Iranian people. And if the incentives are accurate in this UN resolution and the sanctions are carried out, and what, strangely enough, the trail goes back to Pyongyang. You remember the UN resolution just a few weeks ago? That resolution was a shocker to Tehran. What we really do about Pyongyang, North Korea, is what being watched very carefully in Tehran. Damascus will do what they're told. And what we've got to do is make sure that the Iranians know there are terrible consequences for them and their government, particularly, if they don't stop this support for Hezbollah and they don't stop their nuclear weapons program.
A number of questions came in today from viewers about the 6-year period of time that Hezbollah was allowed to build these bunkers and accumulate this arsenal of weapons. And one of the viewers said to me, what about
hours with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert as she embarks on her second round of face-to-face talks in the Middle East this week in an effort to end the fighting here. The secretary met with Olmert at the Prime Minister's home here in Jerusalem, where they had dinner together as well. There's no official word on what they discussed or whether there was any progress, but on the way to Israel, Rice told reporters that the negotiations in the region are delicate and that she expects the weekend talks to be intense. Quote, there are really hard and emotional decisions for both sides under extreme pressure in a difficult set of circumstances, and so I expect the discussions to be difficult, but there will have to be give and take. Rice is trying to get a framework together for a United Nations resolution to end nearly 3 weeks of fighting. Wire services in Israel are reporting that Israel will not demand the immediate disarming of Hezbollah as part of a ceasefire. But other unresolved issues include the return of kidnapped Israeli soldiers and the formation of an international peacekeeping force, which sources say could include as many as 20,000 troops. On Monday, a meeting is set at the UN to determine which countries will be able to contribute peacekeepers. Then later in the week, the Security Council could take up conflict itself between Israel and Hezbollah. During her last stop to the region, Secretary Rice traveled to Beirut to meet with Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora. She is expected to meet with him again. The when and the where, however, isn't clear at this point in time. That's the latest live in Jerusalem. I'm Jeff Goldblatt. Jamie, now back to you.
Jeff, thanks so much. All eyes have been on Hezbollah since this war broke out, and little is being heard from al-Qaeda. Remember them? And what of little that has been heard, is anyone paying attention? Joining us now from Washington, Ambassador Mark Ginsburg, Fox News foreign affairs analyst and former ambassador to Morocco, and in Houston, Fox News military analyst Colonel David Hunt, an all-star panel, if I may say so myself. Great to see both of you. Let me start with you, Ambassador, and ask you, who's the bigger threat right now, Hezbollah or al-Qaeda?
Well, al-Qaeda remains a bigger threat to the United States, largely because it continues to try to inflict terrorist damage on the United States and United States interests. But, Jamie, I want to tell you something. Hezbollah itself has long targeted the United States going all the way back to the early 80s. And while Hezbollah is dedicated to the destruction of Israel, as Ollie North said on your show just a little while ago, it is this runner-up in terms of damaging American interests and killing the most Americans outside of al-Qaeda.
Colonel Hunt, when Hassan Nasrallah made his last tape, he promised surprises, something he said would happen. What are they, and where is he?
Well, he's up in the mountains in Lebanon, and the surprise are, of course, terrorist attacks. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, but they can hide inside some embassies like Syrian embassies and Iranian embassies, but it's all about terror with them. They've got a lot of money, about $100 million a year that comes out of Iran. As Mark just said, they're dedicated to the destruction of Israel, but they killed a lot of Marines in 1983 and got a pass. They're deadly. I agree that Al-Qaeda is number one, but having the head of any terrorist organization come on television is a very bad thing for the war on terror, and it emboldens a lot of people that don't like us.
You know, Mark, I want to ask you, speaking of money, the Colonel brought up a good point. More money is going to come into Lebanon. In fact, the United States is sending $30 million in humanitarian aid. With Hezbollah being a part of the Lebanese government even, how do we know that that money won't get into the hands of terrorists?
Jamie, David was absolutely right, and the question that you've asked is entirely appropriate. There's no doubt that if Nasrallah and Hezbollah live to fight another day, we're going to rue the day that the Israelis did not finish the job this time around. Because his objective ultimately, Jamie, is use the attack that he launched on Israel as a justification to get Sunni, that is Sunni, not Shiite, but Sunni support in Lebanon that composes 25% of the population to join, and if there's another election, they will want to join up with him, and he could very well seize control over the government of Lebanon, and all this humanitarian assistance that's going to flow into Lebanon, he's going to want to get his hands on.
Colonel, win or lose, does Hezbollah gain? Are terrorists of any faction watching this and signing up?
Yes. Bin Laden's alive. Zawahiri's still alive. We killed Zakawi. But this guy's alive no matter how this appears. This is a great army the Israelis have. Mark's right. They didn't do this right. And Hezbollah will claim, it won't be fair, but they'll claim that they pushed Israel back. So yes, they'll gain more terrorists, and they could gain a lot of political help. It's such a corrupt government in Lebanon that, and Mark's right again, these supplies, if you don't watch them and deliver them yourselves, will be ripped off and found in the black market. It's a very bad situation. I wish Israel, who had the impetus, had finished this off. It doesn't look like they're going to.
That's interesting. That's the first time I've heard that. They are, you know, certainly in there 24/7, according to our correspondents. Mark, let me ask you this. A viewer asked this question today. I thought it was a good one. The humanitarian groups that have been coming in and the peacekeepers who were there over the last 6 years while Hezbollah had a chance to build up, why now have they not been allowed, and I only have about 30 seconds left, to see the soldiers that were kidnapped?
Because the Red Cross has not been permitted access to the kidnapped soldiers. Nasrallah doesn't want to tip anyone off where they are. And the humanitarian organizations are very busy right now trying to provide relief to the refugees that have left southern Lebanon and are making their way into the Shuf Mountains as well as into Beirut.
All right, Ambassador Ginsburg and Colonel Hunt, thanks to both of you very much. Up next, you may have known Hezbollah had its own TV station, and you may remember that it was blasted to rubble by Israel. But they're still on the air. How can that be? How did they do that? And then the Syrian president speaks out, and you won't believe what he wants from the United States. We'll be right back.
It's time to play Take on Orbits. Today's players want a total vacation, hotel plus flight, and must save over $300. Go.
I need a deal to Cancun. Done. Congratulations.
It's that easy.
I wish we had a big house.
I wish we had an affordable house.
Find your perfect place. It's easy at RE/MAX.com. Nobody sells more real estate than RE/MAX.
Test drive the DTS at the Cadillac Summer Event, going on now.
Hello, I'm a Mac.
And I'm a PC.
Gesundheit, you okay?
No, I'm not okay. I have that virus that's going around.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, you better stay back. This one's a doozy.
That's okay, I'll be fine.
No, do not be a hero. Last year, there were 114,000 known viruses for PCs.
PCs, not Macs. So, you just grab this.
I think I got to crash.
Hey, if you feel like that'll help, good.
Your risks can change quickly. Make sure your insurance stays in sync. Travelers.
Cholesterol. It can come from fettuccine Alfredo, but also from your grandpa Alfredo, from barbecue ribs, and from your Aunt Barbie. A healthy diet is important. When that's not enough, adding Vytorin can help. Cholesterol comes from two sources, food and family. Vytorin treats two sources. Only Vytorin helps block the absorption of cholesterol from food and reduces the cholesterol your body makes naturally based on family history. Vytorin was also proven in clinical studies to lower bad cholesterol more than Lipitor alone. Vytorin is not for everyone, including people with liver problems, women who are nursing, pregnant, or may become pregnant. Unexplained muscle pain or weakness could be a sign of a rare but serious side effect. Vytorin may interact with other medicines or certain foods, increasing your risk of getting this serious side effect. Simple blood tests are needed to check for liver problems. So eat right, stay active. But if that's not enough, ask your doctor about adding Vytorin. Two sources of cholesterol. Treat them both with Vytorin.
Welcome back to the Big Story Primetime. Glad you could be with us. I'm Jamie Colby. Hezbollah is attacking with new long-range weapons, and their leader has promised to expand their reach. Israel not backing down, battling Hezbollah with full force. One of Israel's first targets was Hezbollah's television station. Both the U.S. and Israel consider Al-Manar a terrorist outfit. Its headquarters now just a pile of rubble. So how is it that it's still on the air? Let's go straight to Jennifer Griffin. She is live near the Israel-Lebanon border, where I hear, Jennifer, a lot of booms. What's going on there?
Well, it's morning here, and all night we've been hearing tremendous artillery outgoing from Israel across the border, just a few miles up the road from where we are, over the hills into Lebanon. But all the artillery in the world, Jamie, has not been able to knock Hezbollah's main station, Al-Manar, off the air. Airstrikes didn't do it, as you mentioned. Its five-story headquarters was rubble after the first night of this conflict. And the way they stayed on the air is that they clearly were prepared for the strike. After the Israeli soldiers were kidnapped, they were prepared. They knew Israel was going to come back at them, and they had alternate broadcast sites set up. And those are mobile broadcast sites. They've been broadcasting ever since. As you've seen today, Hassan Nasrallah went back on Al-Manar, and they were on the air again. Israel has not been able to throw them off. In fact, they call their satellite engineers Fedayeen, which means fighters in Arabic. They clearly see Al-Manar as an essential part of their struggle against Israel. We've recorded in recent days video from Al-Manar. The name means signpost or beacon in Arabic. It was founded in 1990 and serves basically as the propaganda wing of Hezbollah, a way to recruit jihadis against Israel, showing images of Hezbollah fighters defeating the Israeli army in ambushes when Israel still occupied Lebanon for those 18 years. Israeli soldiers being dragged off the field, wounded or worse. They glorify suicide bombers on this station. These images, its editors openly admit, Jamie, are designed to, quote, stir the resistance to Israel. Al-Manar is also a vehicle for Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah to further his personality cult, as we saw in the broadcast today from the satellite channel. The channel tried broadcasting in France 2 years ago, but was barred by European anti-terror laws. It was designated a terror organization earlier this year by the U.S. State Department, Jamie. American companies like Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble have since pulled their advertising from the station. Al-Manar showed this 8-year-old girl chastising Arab governments recently for not supporting those fighting the Israelis. The station, which has an estimated 10 million viewers, became popular among Palestinians by often being the first to broadcast Palestinian claims of responsibility for suicide bombings inside Israel during the current intifada. And yesterday, Jamie, Al-Manar was on the air again, showing off its latest, longest...
Just a second. You're not going to see pictures of this, but I'm going to describe what we're seeing. We're seeing flares up above the border. That suggests that there's more military activity on the ground on the other side of the Lebanese border right now. We're going to pull across now to the artillery that's been going out. Now that dawn has risen right now, you can see very clearly the artillery that's being fired. A lot of dust in the fields there where they're firing. But every so often you will see, yeah, that's all outgoing artillery that we're hearing there. But
it's really quite a sight, all the smoke rising from where the Katyushas hit just a little while ago while we were on air with you. Jamie?
Hey, Jennifer, let me ask you this. They're hitting out of Lebanon close to the border. Does that give you a sense that they are back to using the Katyushas, not the Fajr 5, which hit Afula, south of Haifa, that now their capability has gone back to just being these Katyusha rockets, which don't go very far, aren't very precise, and don't carry a huge warhead?
Well, these Katyushas, the way you describe them is correct, but they have been firing them every day. And in fact, they've been firing between 80 and 100 every day on the north. That has really not changed since this began 19 days ago. And that's what's so frustrating for the Israeli military. And the reason that they're sending ground forces in is that they really need the ground forces because these are small rockets and they're mobile and they're moving around. And that's why they're in there. As you mentioned, the Al-Fajr 5 that hit further south, about 31 miles towards Afula, that is almost, it's an unusual thing. They bring it out once in a while. They are still able to fire those long-range missiles, but what's happening every day is that there's still about 80 to 100 Katyushas coming into the northern areas. Jamie?
Jennifer, Katyushas are cheap. They're easy to fire. All you need is a metal pipe. But is there a sense with the number that are coming in right now that they might be using some of these multiple launchers, that they might have positions that are more sophisticated in terms of sending them off? Or could this be just a desperate effort to set off whatever they have?
Look, I don't think we see anything more sophisticated coming out of there in terms of the Katyushas. It's the same style of firing that we've seen from the beginning. But I think it is significant that they're still firing them. It's a way of saying we're still standing, we're still here. It's a way of taunting the Israeli military, really, because as we were reporting earlier, the ground forces were going in earlier tonight to a third position, and these Katyushas are assigned to say we're still here, and that is driving the Israeli military crazy. Let's go back now to the fires that are the pictures. We're going to go back onto the fires where those Katyushas landed so you can see them over in the fields. I guess we're there now. Jamie?
What's there, Jennifer? Do you know if it's just a field, if there are homes? Because I remember when Rick Leventhal was in a position along the border, he zoomed in, and it wasn't all that far away, to a house that had a picture of Hassan Nasrallah, a huge picture on the side, making it very clear that that is Hezbollah territory.
Yeah, this is a little bit different, Jamie, because when Rick was showing those pictures, he was showing, I think, a lot of shelling and a lot of the Israeli airstrikes into this Lebanese village on the other side. Where we are on the Israeli side of the border, you're right, they are falling in fields, and we see these fields that are on fire, but there are also farmhouses around, there are communities. So these rockets fall in a very willy-nilly fashion. There is no precision to them. That's why we call them rockets. They don't have a guidance system. They're really designed to terrorize the communities up here in the north. Jamie?
And the thing is, Jennifer, that we know that over the 6 years that Hezbollah prepared for battle, they have a lot of other artillery. They have the Zelzal even. So why are they continuing, you think, strategically? You've been in that region for so long. You understand so well who Hezbollah is. Why do you think they stick with the Katyusha?
Well, one of the problems, Jamie, is that the Zilzal, which you mentioned is the longest range missile that it has. It's an Iranian-made missile. It has the largest payload that in Hezbollah's arsenal, as far as we know. They have not been able to fire that Zilzal. We know that the Israeli military wiped out one particular truck that was carrying a Zilzal earlier. We saw pictures of it, and that's when we knew for certain that they had that missile. But it's not clear that they had more than one, and it's not clear that the launchers for that missile, which is much, much larger than these Katyushas, hasn't been wiped out by the Air Force. Those kind of non-mobile launchers are very easy for the Israeli Air Force to spot, and they have hit a lot of those targets. The Katyushas, the reason they're still using them is they're such a frustrating weapon to fight against, and the Army can't wipe out their launchers because they're so mobile. As you mentioned, they're mobile. They're on the backs of trucks. I've even seen some on the backs of donkey carts, so they can move them around, and it's very hard to stop them, and they know that it's annoying for the military. Jamie?
Jennifer, I was speaking with one of our producers, Ian Rafferty, who was there as well along the border, and he was telling me that the rockets, the Katyushas, are mostly dayside when you guys are sleeping at night. So I just want to ask you, are they not capable of doing this at night? Do they not have good night capability? So do the Israeli Defense Forces have an advantage this time of day?
Well, the initial conventional wisdom here was that they couldn't fire Katyushas at night because what would happen is that it gives off a flare when it goes off, and it's very easy for the military to then call in either an artillery strike or an airstrike. So they were more likely to do it during the day because it gave them a few minutes to hide after they fired it. But I can say from having stood up here now for almost 19 days is that they have been firing up at night, but we also see when dawn breaks, they fire more of them. Jamie?
All right, Jennifer Griffin, the action has picked up on the border. The Katyushas are flying into Israel. And that is it for us tonight. I'm Jamie Colby in New York. I'll be back tomorrow night, and I'll see you at 2 p.m. Eastern as well for Fox News Live. I hope you'll join us. And don't forget to send us email at bigstoryprimetime@foxnews.com. We'd love to hear from you. Keep it right here on Fox. This is the most powerful name in news. Fair and balanced. Good night.
Vacations are the perfect place to lose your inhibitions and the worst place to lose your money. Get American Express Traveler's Checks, and you also get a $500 discount card. Good for great deals on hotel rates, airfares, and more. Get it before August 31st.
How do you want your steak? Medium rare. Is my steak okay?
A1 steak sauce. Yeah, it's that important.
Ingeniously designed to help protect the things that need protecting. Energy-absorbing ACE body structure, standard on the all-new Civic. Only from Honda.
We have got to cut costs, people. Ideas?
We could open an account on FedEx.com, save 15% on online express shipping.
Okay, how about this? We open an account on FedEx.com, we save 15% on online express shipping.
That is one. You just said the same thing I said, only you did this.
No, I did this. Makes all the difference.
Bingo.
That's good.
Right on the nose. That's really good. Great idea.
Better health. Sometimes it's in the genes, but as often as not, it's connected to the quality of the information you have at hand. And that's what makes WebMD America's most trusted health information source. It's a place where people find information they could never get their hands on before, where doctors discover new and better ways to care for their patients. A place where everyone can make the connection between better information and better health. WebMD.
I was just getting to the good part when Uncle Ernie dropped his Toms. I'd seen that look before. It was heartburn. Before you could say duck sauce, I was there with my Pepsid Complete. I told him only Pepsid Complete starts to neutralize acid on contact and keeps heartburn from coming back all day or all night. In no time, Uncle Ernie was in Mushu heaven, and I had my eye on the spicy dumpling. Pepsid Complete. Just one and heartburn's done.
Every day, people save more and more money on Priceline. Save when you find your own hotel. Save even more when we find it for you. Priceline now has more ways to save than any leading travel site. Priceline, more ways to save. And now, the 50/50 Hotel Savings Event. Book a hotel at one of the top 50 vacation spots this summer and save up to 50% off. Check out the whole top 50 list now, only on Priceline.
This week on the Journal Editorial Report, continuing coverage of the crisis in the Middle East. Ceasefire efforts are stalemated as the conflict sees its deadliest fighting yet. Plus, an in-depth look at Syria's role in the violence and its potential part in a future peace. And 6 years after his run for the vice presidency, Joe Lieberman battles a fellow Democrat to keep his Connecticut Senate seat. Will a visit from Bill Clinton give him a boost? But first, these headlines.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Darby Dunn. A new warning from Hezbollah's chief as Israeli forces pull out of a key Lebanese border town. Fox News correspondent Jeff Goldblatt is live in Jerusalem with the latest. Jeff?
Hi, Darby. Mission accomplished. That word from the Israeli military, which pulled its troops today out of a village in southern Lebanon, a stronghold for the Hezbollah militia guerrillas in that area. All this after a week-long pitched battle that took some Israeli lives. The place Bint Jabal, once considered a strategic Hezbollah stronghold and called by Israelis the capital of resistance. Senior Israeli military officials say their objectives were achieved here, but it came at a heavy cost. Israel losing 8 troops at a firefight in this village on a single day. Military officials say they're leaving open the option to return here if necessary, and stress maneuvers will continue in other areas of southern Lebanon. But the head of Hezbollah says Israel hasn't achieved a single military accomplishment yet in its 19-day military campaign. Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah said on Hezbollah TV today that more rockets are going to be fired into central Israel, past the city of Haifa, which is 22 miles from the border and a frequent target already. His threat coming a day after Hezbollah introduced a new rocket into this battle, hitting deeper into Israel than it had yet. Hezbollah calls it the Khyber 1, named after a battle between the Prophet Muhammad and Jewish tribes on the Arabian Peninsula. 5 rockets hit near the city of Afula yesterday. No one there was hurt. That's the latest live in Jerusalem. I'm Jeff Goldblatt. Now back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff, for the very latest from Israel. Next news break comes your way at the bottom of the hour. The Journal editorial report starts now. For all the latest headlines, log on to our website at foxnews.com. You're watching the most powerful name in news, Fox News Channel.
Welcome to the Journal editorial report. I'm Paul Gigot. Israel's two-front conflict saw its heaviest fighting so far as a meeting of the United States, European, and Arab countries failed to agree on a plan to end the violence. After meeting with world leaders in Rome, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice Wednesday warned Syria that it was time to make a choice about what role it will play in resolving the current conflict.
The question is whether Syria, which has obligations under Resolution 1559, intends to exercise those obligations in a way that leads to a fully sovereign Lebanon that can indeed control all of the means of all of the armaments in its country. That is the question for the Syrian government.
Does the road to peace run through Damascus? Joining me now from Beirut is Michael Young, opinion editor at Lebanon's Daily Star newspaper. Mr. Young, welcome.
Thank you.
Is Hezbollah weaker or stronger in your view than it was 2 or so weeks ago when this fighting began?
Well, I think it is weaker in the sense that militarily it has been forced back from the border area. But this is not really a military conflict as much as I think a political conflict. You have hundreds of thousands of Shiites who are on the streets, essentially refugees. The party's bases have been attacked, but and its network its military network, but also politically, it has taken quite a beating in Lebanon. That does not mean, however, it has lost the battle. It can win the battle if its military forces remain more or less intact at the end of this.
Let's talk a little bit about Syria, because you've watched Syria and its role in Lebanon for a long time. What is the Syrian role, and how crucial is that role in supporting Hezbollah?
Well, the Syrian role in Lebanon is to, at this point, to rearm the militia. Arms, from my reports, are continuing to cross the border to resupply Hezbollah. Now, the Syrian role more generally, or what the Syrians would like their role to be, is to be a mediator in this conflict so that they can essentially gain from the American side while at the same time defending themselves or gaining cards on the Arab and the Iranian side, which essentially means that they would like to put themselves in a position where they can get political cards without having to make any concessions.
So the Israeli attacks militarily on the roads and the airport and things are not, and other transit routes, are not cutting off the arms supplies. Is that what you're saying?
Well, my understanding is that the arms supplies are continuing, and indeed the Israelis, while they have said that they've attacked arms convoys, you know, that's a very porous border, and my suspicion and what I've heard, as I said, is that arms are continuing.
Well, a year ago, the Syrian army, to great international fanfare, left Lebanon under international pressure as a result of the investigation into the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. But that investigation seemed to have vanished. We no longer read about it. What's happened to that probe, and is it still a factor politically?
Well, in fact, the probe has not vanished at all. If anything, it has gone into high gear because after a number of reports, nothing has come out to contradict the initial finding, the first committee report, that Syria had a role to play alongside its Lebanese allies, it seems, in the assassination of Hariri. And so the Syrians are indeed quite worried that this report will come out. It is scheduled to come out at some point next year, and some observers argue that what's taking place is at least partly today, the fighting in Lebanon was provoked at least partly to derail the emergence of information from that investigation.
So this fighting may be an attempt by Syria to overwhelm politically the reality of that report and to reassert its role within Lebanon. Is that part of Assad's thinking here?
Well, perhaps. It may be a little bit more complicated. I think this fighting is many things. But initially, the Hezbollah's abduction of 2 Israelis was, I believe, part of a larger process in which Syria was trying to reassert its power in Lebanon and marginalize the Lebanese government. And that kidnapping, by showing how irrelevant the Lebanese government was a step in the direction, as I said, of marginalizing the government. And of course, if you marginalize the Lebanese government, in a way you're marginalizing also the investigation of Hariri's murder, because the Lebanese government is the one propelling that forward.
Here in the United States, there's a lot of talk now that the United States needs to go into direct one-on-one talks with Bashar Assad, and that's the only way that this conflict can end in a satisfactory way, and using the Egyptians and the Saudis as intermediaries just won't work. The U.S. needs to talk one-on-one. What do you think of that idea?
Yes, I saw that Leslie Gelb wrote something along those lines today. This is, I think that the people who argue this line have no memory, essentially. The fact is that Hezbollah its military force was built up under Syria. The notion is that you isolate Iran by talking to the Syrians. But the fact of the matter is the Syrians have no intention of breaking with Iran. What they will do is they will try to draw as much as they can from the Americans, and what they will specifically draw is they will ask for, I believe, an end to the investigation of Hariri's murder. They will ask for a return to their influence in Lebanon, and they will certainly not give up on Iran. And they will certainly not give up on Hezbollah, because once you do that, well, what's the relevance of Syria? In other words, once they've given up the one card that they can offer you, namely neutralizing Hezbollah, they are irrelevant. So I don't quite understand what these proposals are, where they're supposed to lead.
Well, what you're saying is that you don't believe you can give, the United States has much to give Syria other than just handing them a large political victory here for having sponsored Hezbollah.
Certainly, number one, and the fact of the matter is the United States, this notion that you can isolate Iran by breaking Syria away from them is ludicrous. The Syrians feel very vulnerable. They will not give up on their Iranian alliance. Paradoxically, I would be much more open to opening lines to Iran to isolate Syria in Lebanon. That's where I think you should investigate. After all, the United States has considered the idea of dealing with Iran on Iraq. Perhaps you can bargain in Lebanon but to isolate Syria, but you're not going to isolate Iran by dealing with Syria.
All right, Michael Young, fascinating insights. Thank you very much for being here. When we come back,
thanks for having me.
Israel suffers its bloodiest day yet as Hezbollah fighters dig in for the long haul. What does Israel need to do to achieve its military goals? Plus, will Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman's support for the Iraq War cost him his Senate seat? We'll look at growing Democratic divisions over national security when the Journal editorial report continues.
Hair color that wrecks your hair or protects your hair. Bingo! New Natural Instincts with weekly color treatment actively helps protect your hair 30% more than the leading hair color. More protection, more shine. Now isn't that more you? Natural Instincts, new from Clairol.
know what you're thinking. I'm so thinking you're thinking plentiful. And there's wholesome grains, real beef, even carrots and peas. Love it so much you only think you're getting spoiled. So happy.
Healthful, flavorful, Beneful. Beneful brand by Purina.
I'm sorry, Jake was next.
Yeah, well, we're next now.
Well, washed all the dishes and I did a lot more. I even bought the dinner at the grocery store. And now, Mom, you're buying the key next door. This little girl's gonna rock it. I left some biscuits for the pup. I put fresh water in his cup. And now I'm off, I'm going.
It's back to school, and Best Buy's got what kids need to succeed. Like laptops with fingerprint scanners for extra security. Convertible notebooks that let you jot notes directly on the screen for new ways to learn. And media center computers that let you record, watch, and pause live TV. Check out the Gateway Convertible Notebook with dual-core technology. It's a perfect blend of performance and creativity. Save big for back to school, now at Best Buy.
This weekend, despite calls for a ceasefire, fighting rages in the Mideast. What's the next step to restore peace? Plus, the president's new plan to stop violence in Baghdad. Will it work? Ambassador Paul Bremer weighs in. It's all on the next Fox News Sunday.
Beirut, 1983. The first Americans fall victim to Hezbollah. You'll hear from former hostages telling stories of covert missions and secret battles to save American lives. It's an exclusive inside look at Hezbollah and the events that bring us to today's conflict.
Welcome back. Israel's government decided late this week against expanding its offensive against Hezbollah, but called up at least 30,000 troops to begin training for duty in Lebanon. This as days of aerial bombardment and intense ground fighting have been unable to stop Hezbollah's rocket attacks. What does Israel need to do to achieve its military goals? Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, foreign affairs columnist Bret Stephens, and OpinionJournal.com editor James Taranto. Bret, from Israel last week, you told us that you didn't think Israel could continue on its present course and achieve its military goals, that is just with a bombing campaign. Is that what we've been watching this past week, that has in fact been coming true? They just are not winning?
I think that's right. I think with an aerial campaign, you always reach a point of diminishing returns, and Israel is very close to that. You also run the risk of a bomb going astray and having a public relations catastrophe on your hands that could bring international calls for an immediate ceasefire, in which case Israel meets none of its military goals. The most distressing thing, in my view, was the decision by the Israeli cabinet this week not to have a major ground invasion and to content itself with a limited security zone in southern Lebanon, and secondly, and more importantly, is to tell the Syrians explicitly that they are not going to be targeted. I think there was a lot of value in having, at least for Israel, in having a policy of ambiguity towards the Syrians to at least put them on notice, make them nervous about where this campaign might go. They might have been able to put put pressure on Hezbollah to rein in, to release the soldiers, and to end the war.
It does look, Dan, as if the public opinion in the Arab world is shifting. I mean, you had originally the condemnation of Hezbollah by Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and now it is changing as these images of the bombing in Lebanon continue. How is this damaging Israel's position and putting pressure on the U.S. to rein in Israel?
In a sense, I think it's damaging Israel's position, but you know, it's a familiar scenario that's being played out. You have an event like this, a war, a lot of terrible images on television, which create pressure on national capitals and leadership to want to do something about it. I think we should really roll back to the initial position, which was there was a lack of support in Arab capitals and indeed in European capitals for Hezbollah. I think that's the real position, and if the leader, if Bush and Condi Rice, the Israelis, and indeed the Europeans hold tough, I think there's a chance here to gain some ground against the Hezbollah problem.
But that means Israel has to prevail against Hezbollah militarily and establish the military facts on the ground.
Yeah, that's the only way to complete this successfully, if Israel stops. Now, a ceasefire now would mean Israel stops trying to defend itself, and that would hand Hezbollah a victory.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, because this war isn't so much, it's partly military, but it's also psychological. Hezbollah has to be seen to be defeated. They have to be seen to be rolled back from the border with Israel. Nasrallah's prestige Nasrallah has to make a sort of concession of defeat. And if that doesn't happen, if Nasrallah is allowed to sort of come up, standing to a cheering crowd, nothing Israel can say or do, whatever the casualty figures are, nothing Israel will do will convince the Arab world that Nasrallah hasn't had a major victory here.
All right, let's talk about Syria, James. I want to quote from the Les Gelb article that Michael Young mentioned in our interview. He said, the former head of the Council on Foreign Relations, said that the administration, the Bush administration, cannot have the stable ceasefire it wants without Syria. We need one-on-one talks with the U.S. and Syria. What do you think about that?
Well, maybe that's the case somewhere down the road, but I think, first of all, we can't have the stable ceasefire that we want without Hezbollah being defeated. This is no time to go wobbly.
One other quick point here. There's something else going on in the Middle East right now. The Iraq War and Syria and Iran have both been feeding troops into Iraq, and is one of the primary reasons we're having such enormous problems pacifying Iraq. To hand Syria a victory now in the expectation that they're going to help us on that front is a pipe dream.
Brett, in the late 90s, the Turks knew that Syria was harboring a Kurdish terrorist. And they said, look, if you don't turn this fellow over, we will start turning you over. And the Syrians began to change. Does the United States or Israel both need to make that same message?
The Syrian regime, Bashar Assad, understands that he's basically, it's a weak regime. And the Turks were able to get Öcalan delivered, this Kurdish terrorist, very quickly by threatening to invade Syria. You don't have to invade Syria to make the Syrians deliver Hezbollah, but you have to threaten them in a way and deliver a credible threat that makes them think twice about what they're doing.
All right, Brett, last word, thanks. When we come back, former President Bill Clinton rides into Connecticut in a bid to save Senator Joe Lieberman from a primary defeat. Will the senator's support for the war in Iraq end his political career? That and our hits and misses of the week when the Journal editorial report continues.
To bring peace to the war-torn region. Rice met with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert on Saturday. She's pushing for the use of a multinational force to bring stability to southern Lebanon. Rice is expected to meet with other Israeli government officials on Sunday. A proposed UN Security Council resolution could help end the crisis in the Middle East. The resolution would call for an immediate halt to fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. It would also seek a wide new buffer zone in South Lebanon, which would be monitored by international forces and the Lebanese army. Iran once again defying the free world. An Iranian radio station says the country's government will reject a proposed UN resolution. The resolution would give Iran until the end of August to suspend uranium enrichment or face the threat of international sanctions. Synagogues and mosques in Seattle on high alert right now following Friday's deadly shooting at a Jewish center. Meanwhile, bail has been set at $50 million for the man cops say opened fire. One woman was killed and 5 others injured in what many are calling a hate crime. A high school valedictorian punished for urging people to learn about Jesus. But who went too far? The class valedictorian or the school district? Alicia Acuna has the fair and balanced report from Monument, Colorado.
I didn't really expect for it to be this big of a deal.
But Erica Corder's valedictorian speech became a very big deal in the eyes of her school in Monument, Colorado.
This man died on a cross over 2,000 years ago, yet was resurrected and is living today in heaven. His name is Jesus Christ.
After invoking Jesus Christ in her address, Erica was escorted off the stage to an assistant principal,
who then told me that they wouldn't be giving me my diploma until we met with the principal.
There was a mixed reaction by the community, and so that's what generated some conversation.
Erica and her father met with the principal a few days later, the honor student given her diploma after writing an apology for not giving fair warning about her speech. Erica says in that meeting with her principal, she was also asked to apologize for what she said, something she told us she simply could not do.
If God was calling me to say that, I couldn't apologize afterwards.
I think schools can't ask students to repudiate statements that they make about religious beliefs or other beliefs.
Constitutional law professor Robert Nagel says the school went too far, trampling on the right to free speech.
Presumption ought to be that religious speech is to be treated with the same respect other kinds of speech is treated.
Corder admits she kept the contents a secret until the last moment, assuming there'd be disapproval. But she never violated any policy regarding valedictorian speeches because the district doesn't have one.
Certainly by graduation next spring, we have something in place and a clear understanding for all participants.
The Corders say they hope to work with the district so that future students will have the freedom to speak as they wish. In Monument, Colorado, Alicia Acuña, Fox News.
From the Fox Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Rick Reichmuth with a look at your Sunday forecast. It's going to continue to be extremely hot across much of the East Coast. Dangerous conditions, actually a very good day to stay inside. We're going to continue to see very sticky conditions, and that means those thunderstorms firing, especially throughout the afternoon hours, again, all up and down the eastern seaboard. In throughout the Central Plains, another hot day as well. Fargo getting towards 101, 98 in Kansas City, 93 in Chicago. So we do have excessive heat warnings once again across much of the northern plains, especially for your Sunday. And finally, out across the west, very improved conditions. Temperatures beginning to drop all the way from Seattle down towards Los Angeles. And once again, we'll see those thunderstorms firing across the four corners. That's a look at your forecast. I'm Rick Reichmuth.
Thanks, Rick. Well, with the heat wave sweeping across much of the country, more than 60% of the U.S. is now abnormally dry or under drought conditions. Stay with us. We'll have more news later.
This is a Fox News alert. Israeli forces have moved into a third location in South Lebanon after pulling out from Beit Jabal. Let's go straight to Kiryat Shmona, where Fox's Jennifer Griffin is standing by live with the very latest.
That's right, Kimberly. We can now confirm that Israel has moved its forces into a third location in South Lebanon after pulling out of Beit Jabal earlier today. The diplomatic clock is now ticking, and there is a growing realization on the Israeli side that the Israeli military has a limited window of opportunity now for the army to achieve what it would like to achieve in terms of military operations in South Lebanon. These are exclusive pictures shot by Fox News earlier tonight of the troops going in. It is still part of Israel's ongoing limited ground incursions, Kimberly, but again, being done now with more urgency as the diplomatic front opens. Part of our team, in fact, was at the border earlier tonight and saw the armored D9 bulldozers going in to level the terrain there. They are also using explosives to blow up buildings used by Hezbollah for cover near the border. They are encountering some resistance, according to our team, who is watching at the border still as we speak. Reports from here suggest Condoleezza Rice would like the outline of a ceasefire to be presented to the UN Security Council by Wednesday. Both sides would like to declare victory before a ceasefire is pushed through the UN Security Council. Now, Kimberly, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah also delivered a taped 30-minute address on Al-Manar, that's Hezbollah TV, earlier today. This is all part of an effort to paint the last 19 days as a victory for his loyalists. He tried to rally his fighters by taunting the Israeli military during the taped interview, painting his army as David against Israel's Goliath, mocking Israel's elite Golani troops who were injured and killed in South Lebanon, recounting his own group's surprising successes, like the disabling of a sophisticated Israeli Navy warship at the beginning of the offensive. What's interesting about this video, Kimberly, is that what you see is Nasrallah sitting in front of the Lebanese flag. He is not placed in front of the yellow Hezbollah flag, as maybe in previous interviews. He is positioning himself as the leader of Lebanon. And what's also interesting, we've heard from our team up in Beirut that recent polls in Lebanon show that 82% of the population there are supporting Hezbollah's activities and not blaming them for the current crisis. Kimberly?
All right, Jennifer, thank you for that report. And as we approach the third week of this conflict, we're learning more about the terrorist organization Hezbollah, described as the A-team amongst terror groups. They are to Israel what Al-Qaeda is to the United States. So how did this group become so powerful and influential on a global scale? Let's bring back former CIA agent Bob Baer, who joins us once again. Bob, thanks for being with us. Now, you've spent time with Hezbollah. You know them as well as anybody else, any Westerner. What separates them from other terror groups?
They are head and shoulders above Al-Qaeda. They are combat hardened. In the civil war in Beirut, they managed to cover up their tracks, and they've had more experience than any other terrorist group. They blew up the Marines. They blew up 2 of our embassies in Lebanon. They were behind the Khobar attacks in Saudi Arabia, hostage taking, and on and on and on.
All right, well, they have been in power and in force since the mid-1980s. Describe these cells. What cities are they in, and who are the members?
They are primarily located in Beirut, this terrorist group that's attached to Hezbollah. They're in Tehran, they're in Damascus, and they're across the Middle East. They can strike almost anywhere. They've attacked targets in Bangkok, inside Saudi Arabia, as I said, other East Asian cities, and there's some question whether they've infiltrated the United States. In 1989, there was a seizure of a ship in Spain called the Valencia. It was carrying high explosives, military explosives, possibly heading for the United States. When I was in the CIA, we calculated there were possibly 14 of these shipments that disappeared. I do not know where those high explosives are now.
Why do you think it's been so difficult to collect intelligence on potential Hezbollah cells within the United States?
That's a good question. And what Hezbollah does is when it creates a cell, unlike bin Laden and Qaeda, they recruit from family members, cousins, second cousins, and they're much more, they know each other and they're less likely to talk. It's very, very difficult to get inside these Hezbollah groups. I've seen it happen once, but we're talking about once in 20 years.
Now, as these tensions continue to escalate, many people, as we discussed earlier, are afraid that this really is establishing a stage for a much larger Mideast conflict. Do you really think there's a genuine threat of that occurring?
I think that if Hezbollah is allowed to walk away with a victory in Lebanon, if they should take control of the Lebanese state, for instance, we could see Hezbollah-like groups trying the same thing in the Gulf, for instance, maybe resurgence, some sort of resurgence inside Iraq, because basically at the end of the day, we have to remember behind Hezbollah is Iran. Hassan Nasrallah is beholden to Iran. He follows Iran's orders. Other Shia clerics throughout the Gulf and the Middle East are also beholden to Iran. We have to remember Iran is pulling the strings. The intelligence is very good on this. There's no question about it. And to answer your question, we'd have to find out what the Iranians are thinking and planning.
And before we go, we have about 15 seconds left. Bob, do you think there really is a credible threat of these cells becoming operational in the United States?
Right now, I see no evidence of it. I think if we saw Hezbollah terrorism occur, we'd see it first in Lebanon, kidnappings, assassinations, possibly a hijacking in the Middle East. But again, it goes back to Iran. Is Iran ready to confront the United States directly with terrorism? And
over a bullhorn, there's chance keeps shifting against the UN, against the US. Death to Israel, death to the US, people have been saying. They then shift to may Allah protect Nasrallah, may Allah protect the Speaker of Parliament, Nabi Berri. So the mood is volatile here at the moment, Richard.
Is this just a protest against the events this morning?
Richard, this has certainly been inflamed by the events this morning, but this is a lot of pent-up tension and anger that has been dwelling deep within these people here in the city of Beirut. We're seeing a depleted city with most of its population evacuated or taken to safe places, yet spontaneously what started as just a mere gaggle of a dozen or so people making an ad hoc demonstration has swollen within an hour to what you're seeing now over the pitches. And the mood is angry. There's no other way to describe it. I was here last year.
But Michael, the question becomes, what can they do? I mean, all right, so they enter the UN compound. They can make noise, but what purpose does it serve other than as a symbol of that anguish?
Sorry, Richard, I couldn't hear the question then, but the crowd is now shifting. What they're doing is they're venting anger. What this shows, Richard, the broad picture, is that the longer this conflict drags on, the more and more angry people are becoming, the more volatile, and potentially the more militant. During the Syrian revolutions last year, there were the presence of Hezbollah activists, yet they're in the minority, and the crowd did not so much pick up their voice. This is different. We're seeing the youth of Beirut in designer clothes now chanting in support of Nasrallah. This could push people to a more militant extreme. Richard?
The government of Beirut, we have heard in the last hour from the president of Lebanon. Does this threaten the stability of that government further?
Richard, I'm sorry, I can't hear your question. The line is breaking up and the crowd is becoming more furious. They've just set up a PA system and they're starting to swell in the car park just outside the UN, so I'm afraid I can't hear you too well.
Right, Michael, I'm going to let you get to some form of safety. I'm not sure what your position is, but I suspect it's probably time for you to retreat to safer ground. These are live pictures coming to us from Beirut. It is a moment that I think it's worth us just pulling some strands together. Over the last hour, we've given you a lot of information and a lot of news, so it's time for us to pull those strands together. A bomb attack or a rocket attack by Israeli military forces this morning in Kana on a 4-story building has killed dozens of people. Israel said that it was targeting Hezbollah rocket launching facilities. The Lebanese president, speaking on this program, said that there's nothing of the court. This was a refugee center. Condoleezza Rice, the U.S. Secretary of State, has been told she is not welcome in Beirut at the moment. This is Condoleezza Rice speaking now.
And once again, I was reiterating our strong concern about the impact of Israeli military operations on innocent civilians during crisis. We are working very hard to try to stop the violence. Too many innocent people, Lebanese and Israeli, have suffered. Too many people have lost their lives. Too many families are homeless. And too many children have been killed, injured, or are living in fear for their lives. The circumstances are very difficult, and emotions are understandably running high on all sides. I just spoke by telephone with Prime Minister Senor and conveyed my condolences personally to him, to the people of Lebanon. In the wake of the tragedy of the people and the government of Lebanon are dealing with today, I've decided to postpone my discussions in Beirut. In any case, my work today is here. I will continue to meet with Israeli officials as we work to put in place the elements necessary to bring an end to this conflict. We're making real progress on a political framework and believe the parties are coming together on this aspect. We are also pushing for an urgent end to the current hostilities, but the views of the parties on how to achieve this are different. The work we do here will make it possible for the United Nations Security Council to take decisive action for a ceasefire as soon as possible. Now I'm happy to take a couple of questions. Andrea?
Madam Secretary, how upset are you that Israel proceeded with this action today while you were here on your way to Beirut? Have they not really scuttled the diplomacy related beyond the loss of life? Isn't this an unacceptable action, military action, in the midst of the most sensitive time of your diplomacy?
Andrea, I fully understand and fully understood when I came here that I am working on this issue in the midst of ongoing military operations. I'm quite aware that there are many dangers associated with military operations. I might note that there are, of course, rocket attacks continuing against Israel as well. And so I recognize that this was not a situation in which there was already a ceasefire. I fully understand that. My job is to come here and to do what I've been doing, to work very urgently to help on the humanitarian side, to represent our views to the Israelis on what needs to be done on the humanitarian side. We had long discussions about that this morning. To talk about the impact that this is having on civilians. Most importantly, to try to work toward political arrangements that the Security Council can act on the basis of to have a ceasefire that's going to be enduring. I was really struck and, in fact, saddened by the references to the fact that it's very near this area that this happened in 1996. It just reminds us how fragile ceasefires are in this part of the world, and it reminds us that we have to try and do our work well so that there will not be more and more and more incidents over many and many and many more years. That's why we're working so hard on the political framework. But I knew precisely what the circumstances were when I came. Robin?
The Prime Minister of Lebanon has said that he does not want to hold talks with you until there is a ceasefire. Does that change your thinking, your planning? And secondly, you have talked and told us repeatedly that you have mentioned your concern about the strikes on civilian targets in Lebanon to the Israelis before. Are you disappointed that the Israelis have not listened to you?
I'm certainly going to continue to press the case that there be extraordinary care taken during military operations to avoid civilian casualties. I think we all recognize that this kind of warfare is extremely difficult because, in fact, it is warfare within situations within territory in which civilians are residing. It's extremely difficult. And it, unfortunately, has awful consequences sometimes, and these are awful consequences. I spoke with Prime Minister Senior, and what he said to me was that he was feeling extremely depressed, and depressed is not quite the right word. He was feeling very emotional about what had happened to his people. I fully understand that, But I want you to understand something, too. I called him and told him that I was not coming today because I felt very strongly that my work toward a ceasefire is really here today.
What does that mean?
It means that I have work to do here on the political arrangements and on how we get a security environment in southern Lebanon that will permit a sustainable ceasefire. And I have work to do here on that issue. Yeah.
Madam Secretary, you always argued against an immediate ceasefire, but don't you think now is the time that perhaps there's a very strong argument for a ceasefire because you are clearly, you've got a political process going on. You're going to go to the UN Security Council. Isn't it time now to say a ceasefire is needed?
I think what it's time to do is to get to a ceasefire. And we actually have to try and put one in place. I've made the point, I made the point in Rome, that we want a ceasefire as soon as possible. I would have wanted to have a ceasefire yesterday if possible. But the parties have to agree to a ceasefire. And there have to be certain conditions in place. Any ceasefire has to have circumstances that are going to be acceptable to the parties. We also have to realize that we cannot have a circumstance in which there's a return to the status quo ante, in which there is a zone in southern Lebanon in which a terrorist can violate the blue zone, the blue line, and create the kind of devastating circumstances that we see today. And we would be not very responsible if we were not attending to those circumstances, as well as working as urgently and as quickly as we can to get the fighting stopped.
One more question, please.
Yes, Sue?
Madam Secretary, some of your critics say that you're not putting enough pressure on Israel and that the United States bears some of the responsibility for what is happening. What's your response to that? And also, have you spoken to Prime Minister Olmert, and what's your message to him?
First of all, the United States has been working harder and harder and harder. I would put our efforts beside anyone's efforts to deal with the current situation, to have a way to address the humanitarian concerns, to have a way to address the inevitable problems of warfare in which civilians get caught up. I would remind that it is because the United States pressed and worked with Israel to get the airport open so that humanitarian flights could get in that got done. It is because the United States pressed for humanitarian corridors that got done. The Israelis don't want to see a humanitarian crisis, and so we have been really pressing that case. It is also the case that I am here, as Andrea noted, in pretty difficult and dicey circumstances, because I do believe that it is best to try to address these issues face-to-face with the parties and to see what we can achieve. Now, I think the Security Council will take this up. We want the Security Council to take it up soon, and we want the Security Council to take it up with as much concrete progress toward a real ceasefire as is humanly possible by the time that meeting takes place. So I will continue to work and work and work. That is what we can do. If there is any way humanly to accelerate our efforts, I would do it. But we're already doing really, what is it, the human limitation to try and get to an end to this conflict.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The U.S. Secretary of State saying that there is more work to be done, and that her work is to be done in Israel, not heading back to Lebanon. John King joins us now. John is in Jerusalem. John, you were right in the sense of a very serious and a very somber Secretary of State, but interestingly, she is putting the perspective that she telephoned the Lebanese and suggested that she shouldn't have gone to Lebanon, not as if the Lebanese, if you like, withdrew the invitation.